said yesterday in the plenary session about we're entering into the phase now of solutions. And it's thinking about that implementation of solutions, actually doing it. And in that context, I want to talk about planning, adaptation planning, particularly at policy, strategy, action level, and thinking also in the context of small line development states where my country particularly did a lot of work in recent years. Now I said earlier on I'm going to try and be a little bit provocative because there's no point in coming to an event like this if you're just going to hear the same sort of things. We tend to preach the converted all the time, and I think it's time we just widen our horizons a little bit. And so I think we've just got to think a little bit different about the way we talk about climate change, the way we think about it. Nothing I'm going to say is intended as a criticism, I'm absolutely far from it. You know, I'm full of admiration for all the work everybody does. But if we are to deliver transformative solutions, and that's really what we're beginning to talk about now, so about focus adaptation resilience, then I think we've got to change some of our approaches. First thing I just want to say is, I don't think anthropogenic climate change is an environmental issue. I don't think it ever has been. I don't think it will be. The reason we have anthropogenic climate change is not because of environmental issues, it's because of social and economic issues. It's a growth and development problem. And clearly we understand that it's a growth and development problem that clearly started off with industrialised northern countries. And because it's an economic and societal problem first and foremost, that's actually where the solutions lie. The environment world tells us what some of those first order impacts are, but in terms of actually managing and delivering and moving forward, we've actually got to start looking at this in a different light. So what do we see? And, you know, when I look at work around the world, and we've worked in nearly 60 countries around the world, and that's both developing and developed, invariably, the climate change portfolio is owned by the Ministries of Environment. And it's often seen as a public sector issue. You know, that this is not something that's particularly for the private sector, it's not the focus, it's a public sector. And it's about the Ministry of Environment. And I just question that and say, well, you know, does that really reflect the social and economic context of the countries we all live and work in? And I don't think it does. Give me an example. This it's not a small line development state. This is an infographic we did some time ago about the Thailand floods in 2011. I tried to do something for the effect of the two hurricanes in Grenada in 2004-05, I think it's right. And unfortunately, whilst there's lots of information about the initial effect of the hurricanes, the two hurricanes, there's little work done about what are the 10 years after effects, the consequential knock-on effects, and they're actually what adaptation resilience is really about. It's not that initial damage effect, it's the longer-term consequences. But when we look at just Thailand, we can pull some examples here that help us understand this societal and economic context thing. In the top right-hand corner, there's a figure of $45 billion, and that's the total economic cost to Thailand and around the world of the floods. But only 10 billion was insured, so 35 billion was a direct loss to economies. And when you lose money in economies, you lose money in people's pay packets. 10,000 factories put out of action. Total output in Thailand fell by nearly 36%. That's lots and lots of people's jobs, and that's livelihoods. 67 million pounds spent by Nissan on supply chain costs. One company spent 67 million pounds as a consequence. Agriculture, in 12.5% of all agricultural land in Thailand was underwater, and clearly it has incredibly knock-on direct effects straight away. And what this all tells us is the language of climate change is not about temperature and precipitation. The language of climate change is about the issues that make politicians sit up and take notice and take action. And these are the figures, not 2 degrees C. Now, we can't understand these figures if we don't understand the science. I'm not trying to dumb that down. But it's about understanding what the real language of climate change is. It's this sort of language. temperature and precipitation and modelling outputs and everything else is the language of climate science, and there's a difference. So if we think this a little bit more about this context, the economy, the International Monetary Fund calculates that the private sector accounts for over 60% of the GDP, gross domestic product, in most countries around the world. And for many countries, that figure is near 85%. In some countries, it's over 90%. So the growth, the development, the investment, the revenue is arising from the private sector. And it's the private sector that produces most of the goods and services we consume and use, and actually provides most of the capital investment. It also, directly and indirectly, provides most of the taxation revenue to fund government expenditure. And that's either directly through corporation tax and profit tax, but also indirectly through paying people's wages and then paying income tax. And so my question is, and thinking about this context of putting climate change into a different arena, is this where the source of financing resilience is, and also the source of implementing resilience and adaptation? And so my question now is this context really reflected in national adaptation planning processes? We did an analysis of, very simple, of just looking through some of the national adaptation plan documents. And just one comment on that, actually, it's incredibly difficult to find which countries have produced a national adaptation plan, because when you look on the UNFCCC site, not every country has loaded up their plans on that. So trying to find what countries are actually doing is quite difficult. But it actually reveals very limited recognition of this context issue, in which adaptation and resilience must be undertaken, in which decisions are made, in which this language of climate change is different to the language of climate science. And I'll just give you some practical examples of that. This is something I did for an event in Bonn, organised by GIZ last May. And we just looked at a random group of national adaptation plans. I'm not going to mention country names. And we looked for the words private and private sector. And so country 1, 112 pages long, one reference to private sector in the summary. Country 2, 84 pages, one reference to private sector in the summary. Country 8, 128 pages, 3 references to private sector. And it goes on. It's the very, very similar story. We couldn't find a single national adaptation plan that had a chapter that talked about the private sector and the economy of the country, because it's the economy that will drive the decision making, and it's the politics associated around with it. And so when we look at something like the LDC expert group technical guidelines on national adaptation planning, which I think are excellent, by the way, but also reveals the following references. Again, a simple word search. 256 references to the words environment, environmental, only 63 to economy and economic. And we know that when we look at the Thailand flood type situation, that's really what we're talking about. This is the language of climate change. Interesting enough, only 48 references to social and society. So perhaps there's an imbalance there as well. But just thinking about the economy again, the LDC guidelines only have 2 references to private sector, 8 references to business, and 8 references to the word investment. And I'm going to pick up on that word investment again shortly. But I think what's interesting, these references actually are very sort of oblique references. They're not in-depth discussions. It's just the word appears in a context of one sentence. So there's no real thought process in terms of the guidelines about how you prepare a national adaptation plan and think about the sector that actually is driving the economy of the country. So I think my concern is, can national adaptation planning processes provide this transformational change, this move towards solutions that Salim al-Haq talked about, if they're not actually framed by the context and not really picking it up? I think the next question I've got is, well, can national adaptation planning processes actually, do they have the power to transform? Again, when we've looked at
national adaptation planning documents and state level, in, for example, in India and other sub-regional plans, most of the documents focus on engagement and awareness raising. It's a little bit, Saleem Huck was talking yesterday about a lot of the focus is still on trying to understand the impact. And I firmly believe, actually, we know enough to make better decisions now. We still need to clearly understand more, but actually we can move on from that and move into this solution phase. So most are focused on engagement awareness raising. When you look at the actions in those plans, most have been developed as a result of workshop discussions. They're very simplistic actions. They're often people's ideas of what an action is based on what they think the impact is. They're not often, or very infrequently, driven by detailed analysis, both of the underlying root cause of what the problem really is, what the financial appraisal is, what the options are. There's always more than one option, more than one solution. So the actions at the back of them actually potentially are difficult to implement because they're not well thought through, because it's through this workshop type situation that's being relied on. And what it says to me is we're looking at adaptation and resilience through a public sector lens all the time, very government focused, very public sector lens. All governments think they are at the heart of decision making in any country, but I know from my experience working for big corporates, we had our own ideas of where we were going, and then we bumped into the government on occasion. It wasn't that the government set our agenda. And so this is the same when we think about adaptation and resilience. So I think that the danger we're falling into is thinking about climate change as a primarily public sector, governmental-led issue, in which it will be that sector which will lead for decision-making, implementation, investment and delivery. But I think that actually will inhibit transformational change because you've not explored the context. So what do we do with national adaptation plans then to give them this power to transform? I believe very strongly that adaptation and resilience, the portfolio for this, should not rest with the Ministry's environment. That they're a technical advisory, expert sector. There are clearly environmental issues that have to be tackled in terms of adaptation and resilience. But if we're to move forward, adaptation and resilience must be owned by ministries of finance and by development planning ministries and or offices of prime minister and presidents, because that is core to the company. It's those ministries that make all the key decisions and have all the power. And unless you have those ministries owning this, climate change will continue to be a peripheral issue in terms of the real context of a country and it moving forward. I think it's important that we see national adaptation plans as vehicles for economic growth and development challenges. But they should provide really clear policy direction and focus to create the conditions in which the private sector is able to invest and deliver. The one thing when you talk to the private sector is always we need clear government focus on direction. If you set the focus, we will work out how businesses deliver against it. But if the focus, the policy direction is muddled, is not thought through, is confusing, it's actually a great disincentive towards action. I think it's really, really important that we see national adaptation plans not as awareness-raising engagement tools, they're investment plans. And that's both in terms of societal capital and private sector investment monetary capital. They should be written that way. They're about implementation and delivery. They're not about, let's tell everybody about climate change. But I think when we look at some of the actions I think we need to put in, I've just got 2 slides left, then we need to say, some people challenge, I've been challenged about some of the actions I've said should be undertaken, are the adaptation. And I just want to reference next 2 slides, final 2 slides against the Caribbean. CARICOM, led by the 5 Cs, Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre, and Leonard is the chair of the board there, produced a very important report called Delivering Transformational Change, which is subtitled The Implementation Plan, and it followed a policy from the 15 Prime Ministers Presidents of the Caribbean states a regional strategy, and then there was the implementation plan. And it clearly identified that the private sector had a key transformational role to play in delivering adaptation and resilience. It also identified that one of the key adaptation actions was for governments to look at how did they change the investment profiles and risk ratings of their own countries. Because at the moment, the Caribbean's in a situation where many of the countries have poor credit ratings, access to equity and loan is difficult, they find it difficult to attract inward investment. All those are obstacles to building adaptation and resilience. So, for example, this ease of doing business rankings, I mean, what that tells me, and this is against all the countries in the world, we've got countries like Haiti, which we understand are 177th in the world, but surprising countries, you know, Barbados, which is seen as one of the most forward Western developed economy type countries and very, very strong links, is still ranked, I think it's 91 in the world. What that means is there are 90 countries in front of Barbados who are easier to do business with, who are easier to attract investment. Now that actually is a disincentive, that's an obstacle. So what we did in the implementation plan is said a key adaptation action is to alter the credit risk ratings of each country. But we also talked about it's important to coordinate government ownership through finance and planning ministries. And I was really interested, I mean, Leonard again will see this because a communique that came out of the recent annual board meeting emphasised the fact that the board and the Centre, the 5 Cs, would deepen engagement with the private sector to ensure broad utilisation of a particular tool that's been developed called Sea Coral. And that's about what are the decisions you need to take? How do I take a decision taking into account this thing called climate science when I don't know anything about it? Because most people taking decisions will never be climate scientists. They won't want to know anything about climate science. They just need to know what do I take into account. And this tool was deliberately aimed at decision makers. And it's also interesting again that the 5 Cs is working very constructively with the Caribbean Development Bank and with other development banks. And it's very great to see that it's just been accredited under the GCF announced yesterday, but about mobilising private sector support generally. So I just want to end on there and just sort of emphasise that if we're going to move towards solutions, if we're going to move to transformational change, then we really have to understand the context of decision making. We've got to change the language to that of climate change, not climate science. We've got to mobilise the key players in those sectors, and the private sector is fundamental to that. And by the private sectors, by the way, I don't just mean corporates. The private sector is a strange term that means anything and everything, but it does mean the farmer who takes spare produce, the subsistence farmer, to the local marketplace. He is private sector. And I think it's super important that we start to see national adaptation plans as investment plans for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think you've raised a number of provocative kinds of statements. You've made a couple of statements which are, I think, worthy of chewing on, and I'm sure we'll get on to them during the broader discussion. I'm now going to invite Dr. Scobie, Michelle Scobie, a lecturer in the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. Michelle is going to speak on climate change governance in small island developing states.
Okay. Well, thank you, Leonard, for inviting me to this panel, and I'd like to thank the organizers and you sitting in the room for listening to us. My background is law. I was one of the 2 lawyers, I think, that raised my hand, 3, and international relations as well. And I'm going to look at the question of climate change governance in the context of small island developing states, particularly my experience, my area of research is more in the Caribbean. And I do see environmental governance and governance as the real issue. At least intuitively, that's what I thought. So I embarked on a set of research looking at what is governance in the Caribbean and what is environmental governance, and if that could be one of the limitations towards achieving improved climate change outcomes in the region. So the main messages, I like to put this slide up in the beginning, so if anybody falls asleep, at least you know what the main message was. That the question is whether and to what extent do the global climate change dynamics resonate in small states? And the argument is that climate change problem for the region is both resource and governance. Because many people think, oh, they're small states and therefore it's an economic problem. But I'm looking at it from, I'm seeing that it's resource and governance. And in summary, that climate governance works where good governance is institutionally entrenched in political systems, and it's more difficult where there are weak and under-resourced, which are not synonyms, institutional arrangements. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at the state of affairs, adaptation, pre-existing development challenges. The question of environmental justice is really central to understanding the problem of climate change in the Caribbean. A brief look at what states are doing in terms of climate diplomacy at the global and regional levels, and then why all of that is not enough, and opportunities for bridging that gap. The research engaged with the English-speaking Caribbean. For those of you who are not familiar with the Caribbean, this is where it is, one of the best places in the world if you haven't been there as yet. Please book your next visit. But seriously, so we're looking at the members of CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, English-speaking Caribbean and Haiti. So first, adaptation. The most recent IPCC report, as well as earlier studies, have clearly stated what adaptation means for the Caribbean. It means new funding for some of the stresses brought by climate change, including water variability, water infrastructure, the protection of coastal areas and infrastructure, the development of early warning systems, the linking of disaster risk management to climate change, improved resilient housing in the face of more extreme events, etc. Health infrastructure. Climate change also has implications for energy and energy use in ways that I don't think we've begun to look at very closely in the region. For example, we export everything, being small island developing states far away from metropoles, which we sell products to, increasing carbon taxes, increasing the price of fuel, putting a carbon premium on that, is going to have implications for our own, for our products entering these markets and their competitiveness. And then, of course, the usual problems. We are not oil producers, at least most of these states, and it means also finding low energy alternatives to expensive fossil fuels for the region. So we have some disturbing projections. Coral bleaching is already quite apparent in many of the islands, sea level rise, and up to 49 to 60% of tourist resort properties may be damaged as a result, and we already see that in many of the islands. Projections to health. I'm here by a miracle because I got dengue, which is a tropical disease caused by a tiny mosquito. And it seemed that the incidence of these as well increased because of changes and variabilities in rainfall. Just a look at, this is from the most recent IPCC report on the extent or the degree of confidence in many of these stresses of the region. So just to provide some context. So we have, in terms of adaptation, we have serious climatic impacts mixed with a lack of funding, the need for renewables, and then we have a question of global to regional governance. But the context is not only the adaptation challenge, the context is also, for example, the high dependence of the region on tourism compared to the rest of the world. This is a World Bank chart that shows the high level of dependence on Caribbean states. In some cases, it's as much as 70% of GDP depending on tourism. And imagine what happens when there is an extreme event like a hurricane that might affect the region, and also some of the stresses that are now being evidenced by climate change. Another disturbing scenario is the debt service ratio in Jamaica. It reached over 100% of GDP some years ago. So we are looking at a context of responding to the stress of climate change with these challenges as well. The question is it an environmental justice challenge? And when we look at this, you can't really see it, but that's the Caribbean's contribution to emissions compared to a state like the United States. I thought, I'll just put it up anyway because I think it shows you the environmental justice question. And this is the other side of the coin, which is GDP per capita of the United States as well. I have nothing against the United States. It's just a good measure to compare with some of the other islands of the Caribbean. So that's the context faced by decision makers in governance. So SIDS are clearly not the world polluters, and there's no global consensus, as we saw this morning, on climate change ethics, and it makes the involvement of SIDS in climate change governance difficult. One of my colleagues told me that every time SIDS got up to speak at a particular forum, they went, oh no, not again, we know all their issues already. So there's not a consensus in terms of what are the ethics in addressing climate change governance in small island developing states. It's not that small island developing states have been just throwing up their arms. These are just some of the initiatives in which SIDS have been involved. There's SIDS-DOC, this one, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, is the regional response, an organization. And these are some of the projects over the years that the CARICOM, the Caribbean community, has been engaged in to try to address climate change. SIDS have been very important part of the anti-emission lobbies. The Caribbean SIDS have been quite instrumental with Pacific SIDS in setting up AOSIS, and that tends to keep the SIDS issues quite clearly on the agenda. In addition, the region has responded to the climate change. The paper goes into quite a bit of detail into how we have how the priorities have been created, established. We have an implementation plan, etc. This is a look at some of the agencies in the region that deal with climate change from particular perspectives. Compare this with, I spoke with the Climate Change Authority in Belize a couple of weeks ago. And the climate change people in Belize were two. So when we think about questions of scale and governance and ability to respond, even to some of the national reporting, we see some of the challenges for small island developing states like the Caribbean. So this person was very dynamic, I think was able to do 10 times more than many people in responding to all the different agencies, both global and regional, that required information from him and myself, an academic, coming to ask questions. And he's managing the future outlook for climate change in Belize for the next 5 years. So I do see governance as a gap, and I agree very much with the last speaker that governance is a larger challenge. Climate change is just part of the larger governance challenge. And this is another World Bank chart that shows the governance effectiveness or the ease of managing governance affairs. And they rate between -2 and +2. And again, we see that few of the Caribbean islands have governance effectiveness as let's say a plus in their systems. The challenge with climate change is to find a way for policymakers to move beyond what is now the practice. And when you look at climate change governance in the Caribbean, it's been generally on a project basis. And sorry for all the people involved in consultants and consultancies, but my argument is that what we've been doing in the Caribbean up to now is moving from one project, often a pilot project, to another pilot project. And sometimes the project becomes the policy. And when the project ends, so does the policy. And when you speak to decision makers, they say, well, the lack of funding for climate change is the problem. And because we don't have the funding, we have to get the funding, and the way to get the funding is through projects. Yeah. And we're very happy for the project, and the political class is very happy for the project because it makes their country makes their party look very, very good for the next elections. And therefore, it's something that perpetuates itself. And the challenge is to break the cycle between project and policy. And that's something that I think it's very difficult when you have all these other competing demands on limited national budgets. So I've spoken to policymakers off the record and anonymously, and they all think that separating climate change governance from the political system and joining forces with their colleagues in other countries of the region could be one way to actually make the policies regional, make the projects regional as well, because I can't understand for the life of me why we need one project in one Caribbean island, and 2 years later, the same project in another island, both pilot projects, by the way, which are definitely short-lived, analyzing the same thing from ground zero. Well, somebody benefits from that, but certainly not the coastal communities that the projects. In some, that whole, the global system of climate change finance perpetuates a local system that is not sustainable when it comes to climate change governance. And I am going to just my last slide, 2 seconds. So the argument is that the present governance model does not allow for effective governance, and it allows for inefficient use of resources that actually come to the region, that the project-based approach to climate change adaptation funding has not delivered sustainable solutions, and the region has the potential to better use the resources to attract funding to overcome the indivisibility problem of climate financing, and then to benefit from economies of scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And now, given that time is slipping, I'm going to invite Virginie Fayolle to speak on realistic financing options for adaptation in small island developing states. Or innovative climate financing.
Thank you, Dr. Nas. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. I know it's Friday and everybody is is keen to go shopping tonight in Paris. So I'm Virginie Fayolle. I'm working for Acclimatise, and actually I've got my boss sitting next to me today. I'm a trained economist and specialize in climate finance readiness in particular. So a number of the topics I'm going to be discussing have been kind of touched upon as part of the last presentations. My presentation is going to be focusing on the financing aspects of how to build climate resilience in a SIDS context, and what are the emerging opportunities in the context of the climate finance landscape. So first, I think it's very important to to reflect and step back and think, okay, even without thinking about climate change, what are the already like the challenges already faced by seeds in accessing finance? And there are a number of them. The first thing is many seeds, and I'm talking in general here, so it doesn't apply to all seeds, but for most of them. When it comes to mobilizing domestic finance, they have limited capacity because of basically of the very small size, the dependence on one or two key exports, and also the population that is spread across wide areas. So these are kind of challenges like they're facing in terms of accessing and mobilizing domestic finance. When it comes to external finance, because of for many seeds of the middle income status and classification, they have not easily access to cheap finance from multilateral lenders, and also limited access to development aid. So when we think about climate change again and recognizing that the International Development Committee has widely acknowledged that seeds are specific circumstances and challenges when it comes to climate change and also accessing climate finance. There are new sources of climate finance that are becoming not available for seeds. However, application processes are still very complex. I don't know what's happening here. Okay. And we know already like the current climate finance landscape at the international scale is skewed toward mitigation, and seeds need finance to actually adapt. So like when you think actually about like the discussion in the context of international climate finance, at the moment, there's a new global climate fund that's been emerging, that is a Green Climate Fund. And the Green Climate Fund may represent an opportunity for seeds, and many say it's a different fund. Why is it different for seeds in particular? So the Green Climate Fund aims to promote a paradigm shift towards low carbon and climate resilient development pathways by promoting support to developing countries, and while taking into account the needs of, in particular, of the most vulnerable countries. When we talk about vulnerable countries, we are talking in particular about seeds and LDCs, least developed countries and small island developing states. And the Green Climate Fund, as part of its mandate, is primarily targeting small island states and LDCs. By, in particular, trying to achieve a 50-50 balance between adaptation and mitigation, so trying to redress some of the imbalance in the international climate finance landscape between adaptation and mitigation funding. And for the adaptation allocation, like a 50% floor is going to be targeting and allocated to particularly vulnerable countries, so seeds and LDCs again. And also, we know for a lot of seeds, it's because of the capacity issues, it's very difficult to access those multilateral funds. So the GCF is intending to have a streamlined programming and approval process to enable a timely disbursement of funding. So one of, I think at the moment, the main challenge is like so to step back, the Green Climate Fund was intending to be the main channel for the $100 billion target by 2020. There's a lot of ambition and kind of expectation around the Green Climate Fund, and it's still early days, and we I think it's a learning process where it's going to go. But I think the main challenge is actually mobilizing funding at scale. And to address this, the fund aims to maximize engagement with the private sector through a significant allocation to the private sector facility. So there's a dedicated private sector facility that aims to provide funding to private actors and support activities that enable private investment in low carbon and climate resilience approaches. From the perspective of developed countries, like the main idea beyond these facilities, given that in the context of strained public budget in developed countries, is to crowd in private investment. From the perspective of developing countries, the main interest is and intention from their side is also to support directly in the countries, in their economies, companies, in particular micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, because obviously they are vulnerable to climate change. So the question I have is, but how likely is it that this paradigm shift will translate into practice? How useful can this private sector facility be for developing countries, with particular reference to seeds, and how can the private sector facility actually deliver on its promise to create the necessary investment in climate resilience development at scale? So there are a lot of questions, but what is useful is, those barriers here are specific to private sector participation and investment in adaptation. They are very well documented, and I think most of them. Like the main one is really regarding the risk-reward profile of adaptation projects, and the fact that the private sector is mostly interested in predictable, reasonable returns at an acceptable risk. But I think the main one here is a lack of awareness also among the businesses, and but more importantly on the public sector side, as we saw in the first presentation, looking at the national adaptation plans, what can be the contribution of the private sector when it comes to adaptation, how do we talk to the private sector on this important topic. So the GCPN can definitely play a role in helping to overcome these barriers, but we need to recognize that there are barriers without even thinking about climate change and adaptation. There are barriers that are already existing when it comes to private sector development in seeds. So, and I'm just covering two of them here. I'm sure there are many more. The first one is a poorly developed financial sector, and this is again talking in general terms here. We know that the local financial institution, because also the private sector is so tiny in those economies that they have high lending rates that obviously act as a barrier to investments, and also the second barrier I wanted to we can use foreign direct investment as a proxy or indicator of where the private sector finds autonomously investment opportunities in countries. So here you can see on the left side, the most, I think it's 80% of the international foreign direct investments actually going to Singapore. So we're just covering seeds here. When you take Singapore out, you can see that the remaining foreign direct investment inflows are actually going to very few seeds. So we can see a lot of disparities among seeds here. So what we need to the question is really, can this kind of issues also mean that as those countries that we actually are at risk to exacerbate existing inequalities when it comes to access to finance, given that that some countries are more open to foreign direct investment and also have like a stronger local financial sector. So some key consideration, because I know I'm running out of time, for the GCF to avoid like further disparities in accessing climate finance and also achieving its mandate of like promoting a paradigm shift in those countries is the need to think and do differently by promoting innovative private sector projects. And I'm just going to show you on the last slide an example of project that is already ongoing, actually being designed under the pilot program for climate resilience in the Caribbean. The use of channeling funds via credit lines to local and channeling the resources through local intermediary banks and financing institutions. But obviously some countries have, especially upper middle income countries, have got institutions that have more capacity to channel those credit lines. And supporting the establishment of public-private partnerships. And when it comes to public-private partnership, it's not a panacea, obviously, but it's also recognizing that the public and private sector operate separately, and kind of like, yeah, and we need to promote like a dialogue between the two sectors in order to make an impact. And also considering to extend the existing range of financing instruments. At the moment, the GCF is just looking at grants and concessional loans, but over time, the idea is to extend to a wider range of financing instruments and looking in particular at risk mitigation instruments that are very important when it comes to private sector investment. So just an example of project, actually, like is part of is being prepared in the context of the pilot program for climate resilience in the Caribbean. So Caribbean is one of the 2 pilot regions, 6 regions, including besides the Pacific. There been like over $75 million set aside for innovative projects with the private sector. So we've been working on this project that aims to support housing developers and construction companies to integrate water adaptation measures into new buildings, homes in Jamaica. And there's been an interest from those stakeholders, housing developers and construction companies in investing and kind of like investing in those technologies and improving water efficiency of the new developments and housing sector. And actually we know that Jamaica is lagging behind some other Caribbean countries, but they don't have access to affordable finance. So the PPCR project is hoping to address that need, recognizing obviously Jamaica is, so Jamaicans are facing severe water security issues that are due not just to climate change, but to a combination of environmental factors, urbanizations, stress infrastructure, and all of this obviously exacerbated by climate change. So it aims to facilitate the uptake of specific water efficient and saving technologies through this concessional loan schemes that is targeting directly the private sector and is going to be channeled via Jamaican National Building Societies, that is one of the main financial institutions in Jamaica. And just the last note is that this is supported, and it's very important, it's supported by a technical assistance grant from the Inter-American Development Bank program ProAdapt that aims to, over time, to also facilitate and kind of promote the development of a market of water adaptation goods and services. So by, in particular, developing business cases and case studies for housing developers and construction companies on the value of integrating those technologies into the standards and kind of investments. So thank you, and if you got any question, we can discuss later.
Yeah, thank you very much, Virginie. And our final presenter, Judith Priam.
Is it yours?
This one is it? This one? Okay.
Good morning to all. So my presentation will allow to make a zoom on two islands in the Caribbean. This is Puerto Rico and Guadeloupe. I'm a PhD student, but I have 3 master's degrees in environment, in economy of the environment and policies. My presentation will deal much more with policies. First of all, I want you to see where is Puerto Rico and Guadeloupe. Puerto Rico is in the Greater Caribbean. It's about 8,000 kilometers square, about 3.5 million inhabitants. Guadeloupe is about 1,600 kilometers square, and we have about 400,000 inhabitants. What we understand under insular governance regarding sustainable development. First, we have the Barbados Plan of Action. In 2004, the Declaration of Mauritius and the Samoa Pathway recently. One thing important is to consider the principle of common but differentiated responsibility under Principle 7. And it appears too under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So if we consider that principle, we can ask the purpose about capabilities, the local capabilities. We could resume relation of Puerto Rico with USA and Guadeloupe regarding France and Europe. So here you see in red the global governance, the international level, then state or states, and the local level. Here you have a simulation of wind energy capacity installed in US. I will focus in that presentation the aspect of wind energy and how the fact you are linked to Europe or US may explain the situation on both islands. So here you can see the evolution. We are in 2002, 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So in Europe, the situation in 2008, I prefer to take that special date because it's important regarding policies. We have in France about 3,000 megawatts installed. Here we have the evolution, USA and France. So France in 1997 had about 10 megawatts and reached about 9.2 thousand megawatts. In USA, started in 1997 at 1.6 thousand megawatts, reaching 65,000 megawatts. So we can compare without considering the area and numbers of the population, but first of all, industries and all those aspects. Here we have a synthesis of a map of the USA's national policy on a timeline. Here we can see the concentration of those policies and incentives since you can see here we have something in 2002 and then later since 2004. Okay, so this is the United States case. Then the France. In France we have that one with about 50 results since the 80s to 2014. Here you have a small presentation of the grid in Puerto Rico. You can locate some power plants production in Puerto Rico in north-south, you must know that the population is mainly concentrated in the north, and the south is with less population. Regarding the windmills, I don't have a mouse, I don't know. No, there's no mouse. So the first windmill, and both have been constructed quite at the same moment. Ah, oui. Yes, okay. So you have one here, and the other one is over there. They have been built quite at the same moment and started quite at the same moment. So we want to look at the situation of wind energy in Puerto Rico and fossil fuels. What do we have? We have 2 wind farms, 13 turbines and 44. The machines are 2 megawatt nominal wind turbine operating since 2012, and we had a prototype in the 70s. So we have around 4,000 megawatt installed on the island. So what could we consider? Why do we have some windmills on the island? We see that in 2009 we had the ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that allowed the development of renewables on the island. Then we have the state-level renewable portfolio standards. That means that each state have to manage and see how to develop renewables. And we identified 2 local laws in Puerto Rico. The first one in 2010, la Ley de Política Pública de Diversificación Energética por medio de la energía renovable, sostenible y alterna. In the Law 83, 2010, la Ley de Incentivo de Energía Verde. Donc, those 2 laws allows to develop a context to develop renewables. So you may have on mind the map of the US with the evolution of wind capacity installed. You see that there's a small period before we can see those turbines in Puerto Rico. This is a prototype of the 70s. Then, in Guadeloupe, you can see the repartition of energy on the island. In green, you have the wind energy. You have the biomass, geothermy, because we have a volcanic island. So we have a geothermal plant. And you have fossil and hydroelectricity. The thing is, both Puerto Rico, like Guadeloupe, depend 98% on fossil energy. What is the situation in Guadeloupe regarding wind energy? We have 17 wind farms, equivalent to 189 turbines. They range from 60 kilowatts to 275 kilowatts. So you can compare the technology. It's not the same. You have an illustration right there. This is a French technology. The island is linked to France, so the technology is French. Here, we know that in Europe, we speak in Europe of the region, so each region is a good level for governance. In Guadeloupe, we may find around, with the laws, the renewable energy development in overseas. It was in the 80s, and then the wind energy program, EOL, in 96, that allows the first wind farms to appear in Guadeloupe. We must say that Guadeloupe has negotiated to have an habilitation in the field of energy. It was the first region of France to have that, and it was possible through Article 73.3. And then we have the Grenelle 2, with the elaboration of CHIM for air and climate. And we have 2007 target for the overseas. We want on overseas islands and countries to reach 50% of final consumption through renewable energy. If we compare some targets regarding renewable energy, we just said 50%, but in Puerto Rico, we want 12% in 2015, and we only have 1.3%. And in 2030, we should have 20%. We can discuss in terms of models. Recently, in September, the minister spoke in those terms. We have a report in Puerto Rico, a special report, to speak about a model to create. We have here 2 articles in the 99 to show that purpose to put it as a model, the island as a model. That is my last slide. When we speak about a model, it should be something like to be perfect. But as everywhere, we have the problem of acceptance, acceptability, and impacts. And we don't have the same technology. Laws may be done in the decision center in Paris, but distances, by example, to windmills, apply to a kind of windmill we find here in France that we don't find in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, there's sun all year long. Everything is open, the door, everything. So the way of living is different, okay? So that's all.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Judith. Okay, now I'm going to ask our 3 panelists to join us. Mr. Leon Charles, Professor Mclean, Professor Nicholls. Yeah. There's one seat here. There's one here. There's one here, yeah. Come down one, John. You have 3? Okay, good, fine. Yeah. And what I'm going to do is ask each of them to reflect for 2 minutes on some of the issues raised in relation to adaptation in small island developing states, and give some kind of perspective in relation to the issues of governance, financing, the kind of focus that should be used, which John alluded to, change in focus from strictly environmental and scientific, refocusing the language of climate science versus climate change, etc. So let me begin from the end and ask Leon for his 2-minute perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nurse. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to respond using one of the hats I wear, which is the Climate Finance Readiness Advisor to the Caribbean Development Bank. I lead the readiness program of the bank, and as part of that process, I work with a number of countries in putting in place the requirements to access the Green Climate Fund. And as many of you would know, the requirements involve quite a lot of what they call country ownership of the proposals and projects put forward by the fund, or to the fund. And that brings me to the issues raised here, because we really had 2 broad issues raised, the question of governance and the question of finance. And I tend to endorse the points raised by Michelle on the governance issues. Because what we have been finding as we've gone through the countries is that there are a number of areas where the governance systems are so weak that it is difficult to generate climate change projects in the first place for financing. Some of the challenges we have found, and this may surprise some of you, include 1, the absence of national planning frameworks in the first place. So we not even have gotten to the point of where we locate the climate change programming. The national planning frameworks are diffuse, and we have countries, for example, whose national development plans simply constitute an aggregation of projects which are identified at the time the national annual budget is being made. So there isn't a broader national framework within which to locate climate change. Beyond that, there aren't in many of the countries, in fact, we've worked with about 3 or 4 countries so far, and it's only one country we have found a national strategic plan for climate change. So again, the approach to climate change has really been reactive based on ideas which some people have, which sound good for a project. And things have moved along in some countries on a project-to-project basis, but there isn't a broader strategic element that we're moving from point A to point B in the climate change process to strengthen our resilience and reduce our vulnerabilities. Part of the reasons for that is the question of lack of capacity. Michelle made a point about limited resources. There was one country we worked in where there wasn't anybody who had any formal training in climate change from the technical point of view. So that just understanding the issue has been a big challenge. So that the overall approach to climate change, as a result, has been very ad hoc and project-based. And we found in one of the countries, for example, quite a bit of emphasis on renewable energy, on solar, and on wind. They actually have wind farms, and they have geothermal initiatives on the way. But none of this from a climate change perspective. It's from a low energy perspective. And when we raised with them the fact that, look, these are things that could actually qualify as climate change projects for which you may be able to actually get some kind of concessionary funding, that was news in that instance. So that while they were doing things from an energy perspective, they were not doing it from a climate change perspective. So one of the things which we're really working with right now is trying to put in place the governance systems from the point of view of the national development and economic planning perspective. And I fully agree with what John had said earlier on, that we have to position climate change as a development issue and not as an environmental issue. Alongside that, we have been trying to get the private sector involved in the climate change initiatives also. And one of the challenges we found with the private sector, and that goes beyond corporate into even individual actors in the agriculture sector, and we've even gone as far as the NGO sector, is a lack of a full appreciation of the risks posed to that sector by climate change. So while the players in the sector understand that climate change is an issue, they see it just as a broad issue which probably could affect things like extreme events and so on, but they don't see it as an issue which come at their operating level, from their business level, constitute a risk which must be managed. So part of what we're doing now, what we've done for each country is develop a plan where we work with them to strengthen their governance, strengthen their awareness of the risks, and to help them generate projects through our project pipeline. Part of the process we're working with is that to enhance a deeper understanding of both the private and public sector of the risks which they face. So I think the issues raised this morning are very relevant. They're very consistent with what we've been finding, working on the ground with countries, and it would be useful to hear some suggestions as to what are some of the strategies which may be useful in addressing them. Thank you very much, Leonard.
Thank you, Leon. We may very well hear some of those transformative strategies from Professor Mclean. Roger?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon. The context of decision making, it should go to the private sector needs that context, and I would agree with that. But I would not agree with one of our speakers who said adaptation projects are less likely to generate profits. Profits, who for? For the government or for the private sector? Every project that I know anything about in the Pacific has been the private sector has done very well out of those projects. I better not say any other words. In other words, the government is the vehicle to the private sector. The aid organisations are the vehicles to the private sector. I have done several consultancies, and many of you have done consultancies that are in this room. And what's that? I'm not a government agent. So there is an issue here, and one of the things, and I'm from Australia, that the analysis of Australian aid has done is that the Australian government makes 105% out of the Australian aid. They used to have an agency called AusAid, That has now disappeared with the present government that we have, but the funds are still flowing, at least in the Pacific area. But the private sector is doing very nicely out of Australian aid. But that is the Australian private sector, not the small island private sector that's doing very well out of it. And that, to me, is one of the big issues. The governance of aid, it needs to be looked at. A related issue is the question of project the question of project governance in a slightly different sense. Many governments who provide aid, or agencies that provide aid, like to see something tangible. We'd like to put a seawall around here, and the private sector, in our engineering friends here, they say, yes, we can protect your town, your harbour, we can protect it from the ravages of potential sea level rise, storms, etc., etc. And then after the physical plant is constructed, the government agent comes along and with a ceremony opens the facility. And that has little to do with the socio-economic side that we heard about this morning in the major plenary sessions, where terms like coherence, trust, decency, values, ethics, morality, enlightenment, and humility were so frequently spoken of. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, we have 2 minutes for you, and then we have to wrap up because I understand that there's a press conference to be held here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed all the talks very much. And I think if I step back away from SIDS, I think really this issue of resilience and transformative solutions, I think we need to recognise the world is transforming. It's happening anyway. And so when... And then that raises the question of what is adaptation? And I think, I think I would take a narrower view of adaptation maybe than some of the speakers, but it's very important that adaptation is linked to development, that adaptation exists in a context and has to work within that wider environment. So clearly it's essential that we link the sort of private sector into that setting. And I think that Roger's made the point about projects. In fact, both previous discussions have raised the issue of projects, and that's something that I think we really need to distinguish between what adaptation funding often leads to is a piece of infrastructure rather than a coherent plan or vision for the future. And when we think about how our societies are transforming with or without climate change, and then think about adaptation within that context, I think that's a key factor that we need to value. And I mean, I suppose I was truly shocked when I've seen some of the adaptation activities where essentially they were a seawall. I couldn't understand, in a particular island, I couldn't understand why the seawall was being built where it was being built. There was no justification. It was clearly just a project that was maybe a pet of somebody somewhere. Rather than, so I think adaptation funding needs to be investing in setting up coherent plans and visions of where we're going. And I think then we can think about building resilience, and we can think about embracing the private sector and mobilizing that in a coherent way that pays in the long, that provides more robustness in the long term. And I think also, given the capacity of small islands states. I think this notion of regional linkages, which was mentioned in some of the, at least in one of the speeches, is also an important point, and to think how they can work together, particularly in regions like the Caribbean and the Pacific, that is another kind of key aspect that is there, but probably needs to be developed, and I think will sort of provide more bang for the buck. Thank you.
Robert. All right, well, we have to bring this session to a close, unfortunately, but thank you, all the speakers. Thank you very much.